Hi Chloe, hi Zoe, it's Daddy. Today I'm going to read you a book from Kuwait. I have my friend Nemo here. Hi. Today we're going to read Mr. Silly by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as it can be. In Nonsense Land, all the trees are red and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forward. They fly backwards. It's a really silly place indeed, which is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives quite the silly looking house you've ever seen. Can you imagine living in a house like that? Now, this story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, every year a competition is held in Nonsense Land, and the cup is awarded to the person who has the silliest idea the whole year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night lying in bed, he dreamed about winning it. He realized that he would have to come up with a remarkably silly idea to win the Nonsense Cup. Mr. Silly pondered over the problem of Nonsense Cup one morning at breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee with a spoonful of jelly in it. Ew! After that, he had a cornflake sandwich. To finish, he had a boiled egg, but being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell too. Isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyways, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking about the Nonsense Cup. He remembered 2 years ago when Mr. Ridiculous won the cup. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounded very ordinary. But Mr. Ridiculous wallpapered his house on the outside. Mr. Silly also remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was Mr. Silly's friend, had won by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, except for one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly thought he'd come up with a thought, but it was no good. He couldn't come up with a really silly idea. He even had another cornflake sandwich, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open. Isn't that silly? On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing rubber boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear rubber boots and carrying an umbrella? He asked the chicken. Meow, said the chicken, because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. Next, Mr. Silly saw a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat? He asked the pig. Moo, said the pig. Isn't that silly? Pigs don't moo, they say oink. It was right in the middle of his walk that Mr. Silly got his idea. It was a beautiful, silly idea. In fact, it was easily the silliest idea he had ever had. He went right into town and bought a can of paint and a big paintbrush. Mr. Silly knew he had to hurry if he was ready for the contest the next day. The next day, a huge crowd gathered in the Lion Square to see who was going to win the cup. The king of Nonsense Land mounted the special platform and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the crowd, it is my pleasure to award the Nonsense Cup to the person who has the silliest idea of the year. One of the silliest ideas of the year, continued the king, is Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow a square apple. The crowd clapped as Mr. Muddle helped up the square apple for everyone to see. He felt sure he was going to win. However, said the king, we have an even sillier idea. Mr. Muddle's face fell. It was a teapot entered by Mrs. Nincompoop. It was the silliest teapot there ever was. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. Therefore, have great pleasure announced to the king in presenting the Nonsense Cup to... Just when he looked up and stopped in astonishment, the king was looking at the tree in the middle of the square. The tree had green leaves, bright green leaves. Not red leaves like all the other trees in Nonsense Land. Green leaves! Who did this? Cried the king. It was me, piped up Mr. Silly. I painted all the leaves green last night when everyone was asleep. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. There's the tree. A green tree, shouted the crowd. How silly! The king said, this is the silliest idea I have ever seen. Therefore, I award the nonsense cup to Mr. Silly. The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. And a bird perched high up in the silly green tree said, woof, and flew backwards. I love you, dudes. I miss you. I hope you have a great time. I can't wait to see you and talk to you again. Mwah. I love you guys. Bye.